الحمد لله نحمده تعالى ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله تعالى من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. Indeed, all praise is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the absolute, the one, the eternal. In Him we seek guidance. Through Him we seek refuge, and only from Him do we ask forgiveness. He whomever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides, no one is capable of the misguidance of. And he whomever chooses to lead themselves astray, no one is capable of bringing back to the right path. And I bear witness and testify that there is no deity worthy of worship except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is his servant and his final messenger. Imam Abu Hanifa once was approached by a man, and this man needed a loan. He was in a lot of financial difficulty, and he needed some relief in order to be able to conduct some of his affairs. So he came to Abu Hanifa and asked him for a loan, a certain sum of money. And in exchange, he told Abu Hanifa that he can keep his house as collateral. And the idea was that if he manages, or if he does not pay back the loan, then Abu Hanifa would be able to take this home instead. And they agreed upon this. And so many days later, when the man finally accumulated the sum of money to be able to pay Abu Hanifa, he goes and visits him. And they agreed to meet at that home that belongs to the man who had given it to Abu Hanifa for collateral. And so it was an extremely scorching hot day. And the man took several hours to get there, so he was very late, and he managed to get late to see Abu Hanifa. When he arrived, he saw that Abu Hanifa was standing outside in the heat, even though the home that belongs to this man, which Abu Hanifa had taken as collateral, was situated right there. And so the man came to Abu Hanifa and said to him, "Ya Abu Hanifa, why are you dehydrating yourself? Why are you standing in the scorching, sweltering heat when you could have just walked inside this house, a house that I've given you as collateral to remain, cool and until I'm able to arrive and we can conduct our affairs, especially because I am late." So Abu Hanifa said to him, "This house does not belong to me. You gave me this house as a collateral, as a trust, but it is not my property. And unfortunately, I had no means of communicating with you in order to ask you to enter your home by your permission, so I can wait for you instead of waiting outside. And so I waited outside." My dear brothers and sisters, today I want us to discuss an extremely important topic, and one that is unfortunately very theoretically understood, very theoretically masked in our community, but unfortunately the application of it is extremely minimal, and we find ourselves applying it less and less in our lives. And so it becomes more of an abstraction than it is a real practical thing that we implement on our daily basis. When we looked in 2008 and we saw this financial crisis that rocked the United States, and we know that when the United States, coughs, Canada sneezes, and we saw the whole world collapsing overnight, banks after banks shutting down, people were being foreclosed, homes were being foreclosed, and people were being kicked out of their homes. Why? Because they were being given all these subprime mortgages. They didn't have to make any down payments. So all these poor people who couldn't actually afford buying houses all of a sudden found it very lucrative to purchase homes. But then when the banks failed, the banks had to repossess these homes, and people were kicked down the streets. And we all saw this in the news, and The Economist, and this and this and that. And now it's old history. It's something that happened 5 years ago, and we're not paying attention to this. We're seeing natives here in our own backyard protesting idle no more, and we've heard this, we may have seen this vaguely in the newspaper and skipped through it and not actually given it some of our attention. To see them protesting the exploitation of their resources, the exploitation of their land. And maybe a few of us will pay attention to these stories. Maybe a few of us will read them. Maybe a few of us will even go so far as to protest once or twice, but that's as far as it goes. When we see injustices happening right before our eyes, we're doing nothing about it. We're not standing with the truth. We're just simply passing it over and hoping either that someone else is going to come and fix the problem, or that somehow the problem will resolve itself over time. And yet, we're so sympathetic to people who live in Muslim majority countries, and we're so prudently aware of the injustices they face. But when we here today, in our own context, are seeing injustices happen and have an opportunity to do something, we may not be able to do something to relieve those who are suffering in Africa or in the Middle East. And maybe that feeling of helplessness, of uselessness, of not being able to contribute is something that haunts us on a daily basis. But when we have opportunities to make a tangible difference, to stand up against an injustice that is happening, where are we in those particular situations? So, to carry on, in our societies, we find, for example, that women who do the exact same amount of work are paid lower salaries, whether it's in the States or in some cases here, even in Canada. We see that even though we advertise that when it comes to jobs, when it comes to opportunities, it's all equitable and it's all about qualifications, but in fact, there is still a very drastic amount of racism that takes place in a lot of workplaces, in a lot of contexts, in your own workplace, in your own classrooms. And again, we're seeing this, we're watching this, whether as colleagues, whether as students, but we're too afraid to intervene, to confront, because we need to protect ourselves. You're an employee, you want your job security, you're not going to go confront the manager about the injustice that he or she is, promulgating against another one of your colleagues that you're seeing day in and day out, and you're silent about this. But we see this happening every day. And yet when you look at nature, when you look at animals, and when you look at how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't just promote justice between humans, this is a given. It's not something you do as a nicety, it is an obligation. Inna Allah ya'muru bil 'adl. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands justice. He doesn't ask you to do it. It's not a supererogatory action where if you do it, it's wonderful and you get good deeds, and if you don't do it and refrain, it's okay. This is an obligation, it's a must. And it's not just a must to maintain this form of justice between your fellow man, Muslim or non-Muslim. Even between animals, the animals have rights. In a report, there was one of the prophets that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent, had walked by an ant colony, and an ant had actually bit him. And he was so enraged and frustrated from the inflammation that he felt that he ordered for that ant colony to be burned and for all those ants to be killed. Ants! How many times when you were a kid did you stomp on ants and actually sometimes do it, almost in a devilishly humorous fashion? You gather your friends and you take the magnifying glass. You do all these things. You didn't recognize that you were doing something unjust. And to you, an ant is an indispensable little thing. I mean, you don't really perceive and conceive of it as something that has a soul and something that glorifies Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to this prophet, saying to him, you have just scorched and killed an entire nation that glorifies Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, an ant colony. When you look at even monkeys in nature, and now psychology research is showing us how these effects take place in nature. These are, and this is a very interesting facet of our modern living, is that we constantly need newer studies to validate concepts that were already declared and determined and suggested and portrayed many years ago. But all of a sudden, when a new article comes out in a reputable psychology or neuroscience or biochemistry journal, all of a sudden now it has weight. Now this concept deserves our attention. And a study was conducted, and I may have mentioned this last year. A study was conducted with capuchin monkeys, where they would take two monkeys and put them in a cage. And they would train, or rather they would have a trainer come to these monkeys and ask them, and give these monkeys pebbles. The monkeys would then be instructed to hand that pebble back to the trainer. And if they successfully did that, the trainer gave them a reward. In this case, it was a small slice of cucumber. And so two monkeys in a cage are given pebbles. Then they go to the trainer and give the pebbles back to the trainer. The trainer gives them both a cucumber. Same amount of labor, same instructions, same reward. But the experimenters modified the design of the study. And instead of now giving both of them an equal reward, i.e. both of them get a slice of cucumber each for the same amount of work, they would give one of them still the slice of cucumber, and they would give the other one a delicious grape, which is, amongst these animals, considered an even more attractive reward. And you know what happened? The monkey who got the lower reward, the slice of cucumber, for the same amount of work, refused to trade it for the reward. And in some cases, they actually took the pebbles and hurled them at the experimenters, protesting the injustice that they're going through, recognizing and understanding and internalizing this concept that when two people do the exact same amount of work, they deserve the exact same reward with no discrimination. This is amongst monkeys. And women are being paid less money for the same exact amount of labor that men do. And this is in our societies. And we as Muslims whom our rich tradition teaches us this. The Prophet ﷺ tells us that there is a woman who will be in the hellfire for mistreating a cat. Why? Because she took this cat and she imprisoned it. Thus, she didn't give the cat a chance either to go and find its own source of provision and eating and nourishment, nor did she herself provide the cat with any food. She just simply covered the cat, imprisoned it, and made it starve to death. And for that, she will be in the hellfire. This injustice against an animal. And how many times a day do people accidentally kill animals, or even go and do very sadistic things to animals, and they just brush them off their shoulders? You and I, how many times in our lives have we done this? And this is on the level of animals. Imagine the treatment and the justice that has to be and must be maintained and nourished amongst each other as human beings. So my dear brothers and sisters, a question each one of us has to ask ourselves in our daily lives is, what am I doing whenever that opportune moment comes where an injustice is being done in front of my eyes? And it doesn't have to be a blaring, explicit form of injustice. Someone comes who's huge and punches someone who's small, and it's very clear that there's a mismatch of power. Sometimes these injustices are subtle, and sometimes they have nothing to do altogether with violence. For example, right now we're all approaching tax season, and as a Muslim, you are entrusted as an amana, as a citizen in this country, to very diligently report your income, your earnings, and all of these things in order to properly pay your dues to the government. Many Muslims, and many people, which happens to include Muslims, during this time of year, cheat nobody but themselves. They think they're cheating the system by evading taxes, or by underreporting, or by writing things off unethically in order to be able to claim a higher tax return. But who are you promoting injustice to? You're promoting injustice against your society as a whole, and it will ultimately come back and affect you. Because these taxes that you're paying are going to the benefits of society as a whole. And one day, you will be that bracket of the community. You're going to be in that demographic that requires that expenditure from taxes. And what goes around will come back to you. And ultimately, you're accountable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even if you are successful and clever and have a CA and know exactly how to manipulate the system and know where the holes are and where to be able to tweak and turn things, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching every single thing you're doing. And everything you do, you will be accounted for and it will be recorded. Now, my dear brothers and sisters, when you see in your own life and in your own interactions someone committing injustice, how do you deal with this? And what do you do in order to be able to avoid these injustices from perpetrating? And how do you protect yourself? What happens when your interests are at stake? Where if you were to go and report your manager, your own job is at stake. This is something I want to briefly address, inshallah, in the next half. Until then, I ask you to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in repentance, seek forgiveness from Him, and make a commitment in your heart to uphold justice. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه ثم أما بعد. My dear brothers and sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله ولو على أنفسكم أو الوالدين والأقربين. O you who believe, be upholders of justice and fortuitously stand uprightly against those who oppress, and testify against injustices even if it's against yourself or your parents or your relatives. This is the extent, this is the drastic measure to which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala very gravely highlights the importance of upholding justice. Even if it's against yourself, even if it will affect you, even if it will torment you, you nevertheless must and should stand up for justice. So when your own interests are on the line, remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who says that whoever leaves something for the sake of Allah, Allah will reward them something in its stead that is better and that will bring them more pleasure and more tranquility in their lives. Anytime you see an injustice take place, you stand up and speak about it. And these injustices, unfortunately, sometimes happen on a small-scale basis, where you can interact with the oppressor directly and resolve an issue overnight. Sometimes they're very long-term negotiations that involve larger bodies of people. Wherever you are and however much leverage you have, you must take advantage of it and use it according to your means in order to promote justice. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what you're capable of. He knows your limit. He knows your leverage. He knows your capability. And He knows what resources you have at your disposal in order to use. And when you don't use them, you will be held accountable for every single time you had the opportunity and the potential to permit or prohibit an injustice from taking place, and you did nothing to make that happen. The World Health Organization is a body of all countries in the world that come and gather together every year to discuss all sorts of epidemiological problems that take place that affect populations and so on and so forth. If you recall, back in 2006 and 2007, there was the H5N1 outbreak. And the index case was actually in Indonesia. Indonesia, of course, is a Muslim majority country, but more importantly to the point, they're a country that doesn't necessarily have the financial capital and leverage of larger players and more developed countries like the United States, OECD countries, and so on. And so an agreement between these WHO countries is as follows. Anytime there's an outbreak in a particular region, that country is responsible for providing samples, bodily fluids, blood, etc. And these samples must be given to key players, including the United States and European countries, who then take these samples to their pharmaceutical companies to produce vaccines so as to eradicate this potential epidemic from breaking out. But here was the problem. Indonesia is a small country. And if they are to give their samples, which affect their people, to the United States, so that American pharmaceutical companies mass produce these vaccines, guess who are going to be the first customers to purchase these vaccines? It's going to be the United States and all the developed countries, because they are the ones who are able to afford these incredibly overpriced vaccines once they're actually on the market. And so the paradox is, even though it's Indonesia that's supplying all these pharmaceutical companies, or is being required to supply these pharmaceutical companies with these samples so that these vaccines are produced, once these vaccines are produced, they're patented and they're priced at ridiculously high amounts such that the people that need them the most are not the ones who are able to purchase them. And this is what happens in Africa, this is what happens in a lot of Middle Eastern countries, and this is what happens in a lot of South Asian countries. And so the Prime Minister of Indonesia stood up to the World Health Organization and said, no, we are going to internally develop these vaccines. And a lot of pressure started to mount on him from all these countries saying, but now you're threatening global security and global health and so on and so forth. And he retaliated by saying, every country in the WHO is ultimately there to serve primarily the interests of its people first and then the world at large. And so when he took this stand, when he took this position, when he upheld this injustice that is taking place against his people, he could have very well sold out and just given a license and allowed these pharmaceutical companies to do so, and perhaps taken a bribe in the process and made a few very influential friends. But he took a stand against the strongest, most influential countries in the world. And a resolution was passed to the great pleasure of Indonesia, allowing them first rights to these vaccines. And ultimately an agreement was reached. And so whether you're in a position of influence where you're governing a large number of people and the decisions you make and the injustice that you uphold can affect a wide scope of individuals, or if it's small in terms of its weight, understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who knows and assesses your intentions and your opportunities. And so my dear brothers and sisters, I ask you all to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in sincere repentance and to make a sincere effort in every day in your life When you see injustices taking place, don't wait for someone else to come and fix the problem. Don't expect that some bystander is going to deal with it and use that as an excuse to alleviate your conscience of that responsibility. Assume that no one is going to do it unless you do. And step forward and take charge. And if you suffer consequences in the process, understand that many more people before you have suffered greater consequences, and ultimately Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the ultimate judge. And that is why His name is Al-Adl. He is the just. And on the Day of Judgment, where nobody can tweak numbers, where nobody can use their persuasive, tongues or their charismatic personality or their manipulative tactics, when all truths, all facts are revealed, that is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you your reward. So even if you don't get the instant gratification in this dunya, understand that this is an investment for the hereafter. So my dear brothers and sisters, I ask you all to commit to this and to take this ownership and understand that as a Muslim, justice is not some superfluous behavior. It is not some nicety. It is an obligation. It is the cornerstone of your belief as a Muslim. And any conversation and any people who are at the crux of suffering and injustice are people who deserve every ounce of energy that we can afford them. Because we ultimately are here to better this dunya and to better our akhirah. And any opportunity we have to alleviate suffering is an opportunity to bring ourselves closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So my dear brothers and sisters, in any dialogue or conversation or opportunity you have, Muslims have to be at the forefront of these ethical discourses and have to be at the forefront of acting and not just simply requesting others to act or protesting or just simply, hoping for it to happen. It has to be something you and I take charge of in every day of our lives. And believe me, every day in your life, there is an opportunity. It's often very, very small. It's never so blaringly obvious. But there is a small opportunity every day in your life when you will see an injustice being committed in front of you and you will walk away. And I ask you by Allah, the next time it happens, force yourself to stop. Even though your metro is 2 minutes away and you don't want to be late and you're seeing this person being mistreated, but you really have to catch your appointment, don't go away. Do what is right, even if it's at a personal expense to you. Because this is what we're here for after all. This dunya is not supposed to be easy. It's not supposed to be a smooth sailing ride. It is supposed to be an effort expending process where we're constantly striving against ourselves, constantly making personal sacrifices for the greater good of humanity and for the sake of Allah. Allahumma hdina fi man hadayt, wa afina fi man afayt, wa tawallana fi man tawallayt, wa barik lana fi ma a'tayt, wa qina wasrif 'anna bi rahmatika sharra ma qadayt, fa innaka taqdi bil haqqi subhanaka innahu la yuqda 'alayk. إنه لا يذل من واليت ولا يعز من عاديت تباركت ربنا وتعاليت. اللهم لا تجعل لنا في هذا اليوم العظيم ذنبا إلا غفرته ولا هما إلا فرجته ولا مريضا إلا شفيته ولا مبتلا إلا عافيته ولا طالبا إلا وفقته ولا داعية إلا نصرته برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. عباد الله, إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands justice and excellence in everything you do, and maintaining your ties of kinship. وَيَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنْكَرِ وَالْبَغْيِ. And He forbids you from any lewd behavior, from any injustice that you commit others, and from any oppressive behavior you commit against your souls. يَعِظُكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَذَكَّرُونَ. And He just warns you and reminds you, perchance you may heed this advice. فَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ الْعَلِيَّ الْعَظِيمَ الْجَلِيلَ يَذْكُرُكُمْ. So remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the high, the great, the merciful, and the just, and He will remember you. وَاشْكُرُوهُ عَلَى نِعَمِهِ يَزِدْكُمْ. And thank Him abundantly for His provisions and for His gifts to you, and He will increase you more. وَلَذِكْرُ اللَّهِ أَكْبَرُ وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ مَا تَصْنَعُونَ. And the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is higher and greater, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows and watches everything you do. أقم الصلاة.